All right, so today is an extremely exciting day. We've got the Bearhawk on its main landing gear. It's on her own 3 legs, I guess, if you want to think of it like that. And I'm super excited to share the process of that, some of the pitfalls that I ran into, the challenges associated with this, as well as just the process over the last several months, because this has been in the works since really January of this year. But let's jump straight into it. We're gonna start here with the Tailwheel, and then we'll move on to the mains after that. Let's get started with it today. Back in January, during my winter break, I began to install the Tailwheel. This came with the aircraft, and there are several options for the Bearhawk builder to select their style of tailwheel. I chose the just basic Bearhawk tailwheel, which is a stinger spring. I'm not gonna ever be landing on large rocks and riverbeds, so this will be fine for me. I cleaned out the hole because paint did get inside of where the stinger attaches to the fuselage, and then I ended up tapping it into place. It's still a pretty tight fit, which you want, but I did have to take some paint out of there to get this thing to line up correctly. Now there are several other options for tail wheels on all the Bearhawks. I know that Acme has a tail wheel that a lot of guys have liked. The Scott 3200 can go on here, and that's a great fit for this aircraft. So leaf spring, T3 mount, and factory stinger spring are really the 3 main options. And like I said, I went with this one because it was included in the kit. It was relatively easy to install. I've never flown on a stinger before. Just looking at it, I'm not a huge fan of that style, but it obviously holds up well on the 5s, so I am excited to see how this one holds up for my companion. I put some sleeve retainer fluid in there, and that is a huge thing that you need to be aware of if you are building a Bearhawk. That's a critical component for your build. Next, I began assembling the shock struts that the gear rides on. Now these are pretty cool struts that have a spring that when the aircraft lands, compresses both that spring and a hydraulic fluid, it's actually just automatic transmission fluid, to cushion the aircraft's landing. There's a lot of videos out there on how to do this, but basically you have a plunger with several seals on it that compress that spring. And you want to make sure that each of these has been deburred, sanded, cleaned up, and you follow the plans to the T to make sure that you have the correct buildup. There are different size O-rings, but all of this comes in the standard kit rather than having to outsource this like somebody that was doing a plans build would have to do. Another thing I would recommend is if you are doing a plans build, you can buy these kits from Bearhawk, and it will save you a ton of time from having to get a specific spring manufactured and the tubing welded up and all that stuff. Just go ahead and reach out to Virgil over there, and he can hook you up with this component to save several hundred hours possibly of welding and painting and manufacturing of that spring. I lubricated the sides of the housing and then began to assemble the spring over the piston. One thing that I figured out here, and a lot of builders have shared this, is if you take a socket and a 1/2-inch bolt that has the correct thread size, you can compress this spring down to where you can slide it down into the housing and then pop the snap ring into it. The easiest way I found to tighten that bolt down was to use a vise and a glove wrapped around the spring so that way it would not damage that piston that seals inside of the housing, and then tighten it down until I'd compress the spring enough for the top of that system to slide past the retaining snap ring. There's also on new kits a pre-drilled MPT fitting that will allow you to fill fluid into this port. You need to make sure that you don't damage that while installing it. You're going to want to invest in a good set of snap ring pliers, and I kid you not, this took me about 2 hours to do, so this is why I have a slight sigh of relief right here when I finally actually get this snap ring put in. I'm not sure if I didn't have enough clearance or why it was so difficult, but when it finally took and stayed, I was extremely excited. From there, you just slowly release the bolt out of the spring and then take it off, and it should stay. The fitting to fill this port is very small, so I emptied out an oil can and replaced it with this ATF fluid. You're going to want to use either hydraulic fluid or what is recommended by the Bearhawk build manual, transmission fluid. And then I simply opened up the MPT fitting, and begin to fill it until the chamber overflows. The spring itself will actually dampen the oscillations once the aircraft's on the ground, but really hard landings will be primarily dampened by the incompressibility of this transmission fluid. So it's important to make sure this is filled up as much as possible and then reseal with the cap once you are finished. Next, I began to locate all the hardware and the gear leg for the main landing gear. This was fairly self-explanatory, and there is a good call out for this in Bearhawk's website now, so you're able to go find this hardware and get it assembled very easily. There's 2 bolts, they're slightly different sizes, but the gear lined up perfectly from the factory, and I was just doing an alignment check before I install the wheels and brake. And I have an exciting announcement about the wheels and brakes that I'm using on this kit. All right, I am super excited to be partnering with Cleveland Wheels and Brakes on this build. I am running on a set of Cleveland wheels and brake combination system, and it's the double puck or the double brake caliper setup to where I have 2 of the linings, brake linings for each rotor, 2 pairs. I'm super excited about that. This aircraft I do plan on using in STOL competitions, and having that extra ability to hold things together depending on what engine I put in the aircraft, which I'm looking forward to sharing that in the next few videos. I am going to need that extra braking action. So this is the perfect setup for this aircraft. Now, a couple things about these brakes. They're not the lightest brakes that are out there, but they are for a certified aircraft, and there is a second company or another company that produces wheels and brakes that are kind of a common go-to for the Bearhawk, and unfortunately a lot of those have broken. The calipers are either breaking or the wheels themselves have received some damage, and I've kind of heard some chatter about that through a couple channels with Bearhawk. So just make sure you are conscious of what you're putting on your aircraft. Lighter's not always better, especially when it comes to the integrity of holding your anywhere from 2,200 all the way up to 3,000 pound aircraft. It's a critical component in my mind, and that's why I'm excited to be flying on Cleveland Wheels and Brakes. Special thank you to Cleveland for sponsoring this build, and I look forward to sharing more about them as we continue this process. These are incredibly well built and very nice brand new wheels and brakes that I'm installing. And I'm not going to go through the process of how to install wheels and brake here, but I did want to share, if you were changing a tire, having one of these tubs, which this is just one of those gritty towel tubs, can really help to hold the hardware in place while you start attaching the first few washers and nuts. It makes it way easier to get that hardware started, and then you can come back and actually torque down the hardware to the correct specs, which is very easy to find in the documentation from Cleveland. I'm just running some old AirTrack 6x6 tires on these, and I'm probably going to go to the 8.5x6 tire at some point, but right now I'm just putting these on as almost run out wheels to allow me to get everything situated and continue to work on my aircraft. Next, I begin to prep the main landing gear for the wheels to be assembled onto them. And here I just do a quick fit check to make sure everything is going to align correctly. The first thing that I ended up doing was making sure that the caliper backplate was lined up correctly, and I wanted to make sure, fully assembled, that there was nothing going to be in the way of this caliper. So I actually checked the caliper's fit in a specific location, marked that, and then clamped the backplate down using 2 clamps. Then using a really good metal drill bit, I drilled out the holes, which are 5 and 6 AN bolts that go through right here. And this is pretty specific to Cleveland, so just depending on what system you're using will depend on the bolt size. Just be very careful. This is gonna be a challenging process. It was for me. It took several days to get this done correctly. There's a lot of different ways that somebody can do this. I used a combination of step bits, reamers, and a really, really good sharp bit. And make sure that if you need help, you get it. And the alignment of these are very critical. I'm not 100% pleased with the way I've got mine. I can tell that it's about a 1/4 inch off between each of these gears, but I got everything drilled out, and then they send you some primer and touch-up paint in the kit, so that's what I'm doing right here. All right, that looks hideous. It'll work. Okay, so I learned a lesson here. The plans call for AN 6-5 bolts to be installed here, and I kind of wanted to show this. This is an AN6-5, A, because there's the absence of a hole at the top of it. That bolt is not long enough for this application. If you take, and at minimum, you would need and I guess I could use a flat washer that is a thin washer, but even then, I don't think it's long enough. If you take a bolt and you take a nut and a washer, which is the minimum hardware that you install on this, there's no way to get this bolt to go on that back plate and that caliper bracket and have enough threads going through the end of it. And this is, this is something that I've had dealt with for a long time. What seemed like hardware that was incorrect, in reality, every plan, depending on what the tolerances of the material are, could be the next size up or down for a bolt. So in my case, I'm gonna go up to a 6.6 at least, maybe a 6.7, and then install this. So that way I have at least 2 threads protruding from my nylock. If you're curious why I'm doing that, go check out AC 4313. It explains everything. Yeah, that's why I'm doing this, is I'm making a longer bolt here, not what was called for, because it honestly just is different. With the back plates fully installed, it was time to move on to installing the actual main gear legs themselves. Now these gear will have to come off several times. I will likely cover this in some heavy duty fabric. I know there are some builders that are covering these gears with a sheet metal or aluminum fairing that goes across this. I just like the simplicity of the idea of covering it. So I'll be doing that at some point, but I wanted to go ahead and install everything, get it on its main gear. And I'm excited. I know it's been 10 months that I've been working on this aircraft, but to be over halfway done with the wings and now the gear on the aircraft, getting ready to move right into covering and getting started with the interior. There's a lot that I've got to do, but there's a lot that I've done here, and there's so much more that I haven't really been able to share just yet because of the timing of these videos. After I got the tires installed, I then installed the axle nut that goes on the very end. One of these was boogered up a little bit, and I don't really know how or where that came from, but some of the threads inboard were messed up, so I had to chase that with a die to get that to clean up. Then I began to install the compression shock struts here. I started by installing the eye bolts, which will adjust the gear spread towards the end, and then reamed out and cleaned out each of the connection points on the actual airframe and main gear themselves, where these will go. This would have been really helpful to have a second person, but it wasn't terrible with the setup that I had using a sawhorse and a suspension there. And make sure that when you install these, the fill port is pointed up. There will be an access panel that you can use to inspect from the floorboard above. So this will be a critical step to just make sure that that fill port is up in case you ever had to service these struts for whatever reason. With this installed, it was time to finally put the aircraft on its main gear for the very first time. The sense of accomplishment of seeing this aircraft roll around on its own gear, even with the finishing hardware not installed, and knowing that it's all coming back apart likely 2 or 3 more times, was immense. And it was really motivating to continue working on this project. After cleaning up the floor for a little bit, I marked out the 72 inches, which is supposed to be what the gear span is without any weight on the frame. I think 74 inches is the final span for this aircraft. Between the gear, the wheelbase span here. Super excited to have the main gear and the tail wheel on the Bearhawk now. Definitely want to make sure you're in the forums as well as the build manuals for this process if you're building a Bearhawk, but we have got so much coming down the pike. I know I've got to talk about the rudder pedals and the brake lines. We've got a ton of stuff going on here in the hangar. We've got the control surfaces on the tail going on next. We've got a big surprise in this box, as well as the Cessna 140 herself, if I can get to it up here. We got a major makeover coming in for her in the next few weeks. So I'm looking forward to sharing that. I'm looking forward to sharing all the stuff that we've got going on here in the hangar with you all, and I appreciate you watching. I will see you in the next one. Have a great day.